Hello, and welcome to module number 8, Taking Action, Diagnosing, Defining, Communicating, and Designing Interventions for Ineffective Teaching. Before we get into module 8, we are going to revisit the learning map for our course. We have spent the last 7 weeks really developing our understanding and our skills to support effective evaluation practices, working within an evaluation system based on standards. 98% of our work with that evaluation is about facilitating the conditions for growth. Specifically, the last 3 weeks, we really spent a lot of time inside that instructional framework to hone in on the evidence that we're collecting in order to give effective feedback to teachers and to facilitate their own reflection to support their growth. This week, we are going to shift to taking action in addressing ineffective teaching practices. There's 3 main parts to this: diagnosis, defining and communicating, designing interventions. We're only going to spend 1 week on ineffective teaching. I really want to emphasize that all of the knowledge and skills that we've been developing and using to support evaluation itself are the same. That's the same set of knowledge and skills that we're going to be using when addressing ineffective teaching practices. There's 3 objectives for this module. The first is to find ways or review ways to diagnose ineffective teaching practices. Once we've identified and diagnosed what the ineffective practices are, and this is closely connected to the recognition and collection of evidence to support and identify effective teaching, we are then going to identify strategies to communicate concerns, and then we're going to learn about the components of an effective intervention plan. As we learned in the first 2 weeks of our course, evaluation itself serves several different purposes, and 98% of teacher evaluation is to support teacher growth and continuous improvement of practice. 2% of evaluation is going to be spent addressing ineffective teaching practices. And when you become a supervisor and you're evaluating staff members, you will come across a time when you are going to have to address ineffective teaching practices. And so we want to build our knowledge and skills so that not only we can address that, but we can help then the individual grow. But there also, unfortunately, there are times where you actually will coach somebody out of the profession or even be a part of a dismissal of an individual teacher. So our focus is to use what we know and to leverage those measures and skills and practices that we've been exploring and learning about to then diagnose, define, and communicate when there is a problem, and then using a continuum of interventions to support teachers in addressing ineffective practices. So the background and research, there, I am going to give you an overview through slide decks. The slide decks this week are not annotated, so you will need to read through those. But I am not going to have you read the complete text for this course. There are 2 main texts that I'm pulling information from to frame our learning for the week. The first is Hard Conversations Unpacked by Jennifer Abrams. Now, I do suggest that as you continue on your leadership journey, if you have not already, that you do invest in a complete text that addresses hard conversations, because hard conversations are a part of leadership, period. And so, in Hard Conversations, Jennifer Abrams provides a framework for leaders to consider when they are addressing difficult topics. And in addition to that, it's really important at any part of evaluation. And we've talked about, and you have shared that effective feedback you have received through the evaluation process, that not only do you appreciate when somebody recognizes what you're doing, you also appreciate when somebody has the courage to identify an area where you could grow. And so, in order to do that, not only to provide that feedback, but to receive that feedback, we have to establish a trusting environment, and a growth minded culture where people understand and really believe that and trust that evaluation is for improvement. It isn't a got you kind of thing. There's, like I said before, there are a lot of different resources available, but this is definitely something that will be useful for you. The second text is Strengthening Teacher Evaluation, Taking Action to Improve Ineffective Instruction. It really specifically zeroes in, and it provides this process when dealing with ineffective practice to diagnose, define and communicate, and then design an intervention. And as illustrated, this isn't necessarily a linear process. And so we will, hopefully you will get into understanding how there's a lot of factors that are at play, and you definitely use gradual release in assessing the intensity of the concern, and the intensity of the intervention. So these are the two main area or main things. And here's how I've organized the information. So I have provided you with two slide decks, and again, they're not narrated, so you will have to take time to read them. Um, as you're going through these slide decks, really think about how this connects to your prior learning in this course. So, the first slide deck is really about two things: it's about identifying and diagnosing a problem, and it's about having hard conversations. And so it starts off with providing you with a frame for how to plan out hard conversations. And it might seem silly when I work with newer principals. I recommend to them that it is beneficial to map out and plan your conversation and to be prepared for that conversation. In some instances, we even talk about using that conversation map with the person you're having the conversation with, so they can follow along as well, like the different things that you're talking about. Um, it is also very important that um, in having hard conversations and in identifying or diagnosing problems, that you rely on evidence. And so the last 3 weeks, our work of really clearly defining what are the evidence or data sources that I'm using as I'm working through that evaluation process, you're going to continue to do this. And what I appreciate, the difference between how we've been looking at data and evidence in the past modules compared to this one, is they're really going to connect. First, they're going to start with, okay, what would be the data or evidence that I would be collecting to assess classroom environment, to assess instruction, And then they're also going to get into assessing professionalism. And we did not talk about that in our last two modules. And so we are collecting data and evidence, and then we're looking for symptoms. And so you're starting to identify like a mental picture for what would it look like if a staff member was not meeting expectations. What would be some symptoms that we would see, or some red flags that would clue us in that something's not right here? And so you're going to use the data that you're collecting and the data connected to those symptoms. And then you're going to start asking yourself some diagnostic questions to really get to the root issue. And so this is something that you will internalize over time as a supervisor or evaluator. Again, in my work with principals, when I am helping them think through how to identify that leverage point or that main problem area, I take them through those diagnostic questions to really get at the root issue. Because when you're working to improve practice, you can't address a million things all at one time. You really want to get to that root issue, and not even the surface issues. So the first slide deck is really going to get at looking at your evidence in a different frame, very pointedly looking at your evidence to identify symptoms of ineffective teaching. And then the second slide deck is really getting at defining, communicating, and designing interventions. And so it's going to start off by, again, reviewing that diagnostic um, uh, process. And one part of the diagnostic process that I do want um, to highlight is that one of your questions that you ask yourself is like, is this something that we are seeing across classrooms? So, for example, at one point when I was a principal, almost everybody was falling in basic for using assessment and instruction. Well, I realized, and I would acknowledge during the evaluation process, hey, this is something that we have not attended to as a school. And so this is going to be a professional learning focus for the entire school moving forward. And so I knew this wasn't a targeted focus for an individual, because I was seeing a trend across all teachers. So that's something that you do need to think about. Like even with classroom environment, I mean, if you are having like an entire school or an entire grade level that doesn't have routines and procedures in place, that is a professional learning issue. That's a school issue or need that you can address as a school, not with an individual. So I think that's an important diagnostic practice that's reinforced in that second slide deck. And then it really gets into your strategies for communicating and defining the problem, and then developing interventions. And so when we're communicating a problem, really the goal is to support growth. And so the goal is to provide a very concrete and clear description of what is currently happening in the classroom. And that's why the data is so important at this point in time. And then to very clearly communicate what the expected practice would look and sound like. And so that is the goal of diagnosing and communicating a problem. That requires courage and conviction. And again, like I said, it's not a matter of if this will happen once you become an educational leader. It's when will it happen? And we have to remember our purpose is to serve and support students. Students only have 1 year of that grade level. And so it is imperative that if there are ineffective practices, that we address that. And so then the second part of this is, so it's really focusing on the evidence and that connection to student outcomes. and communicating in a way that is very clear, direct, and not personal. So it isn't about me and how I would do things, but it's about the expectations that are laid out in that framework. So really using the language from the framework, using the evidence that's being collected, and using that continuum within your own frameworks for those performance levels. One thing, when you are communicating issues, that takes place along a continuum. So that's another rule of thumb that I use. That I use as an evaluator is like I always say, like, resolve the issue at the lowest level. And so um, is it like, okay, I'm noticing this, and I really like the continuum that's laid out here for concerns is, okay, is this, do I just need more information? So I might go into the classroom a couple more times, or I might ask some questions like, I noticed, and so I'm curious, tell me more about. And so that is a real initial way. And then I call it the off paper. So that informal of, okay, this isn't okay. I might drop an email, I might have a conversation, but I'm being very clear on that the expectation isn't being met and what the expectation is. I think it's really important, and so many concerns can be addressed through that end of the continuum if you intervene early, just like with students. If you allow the problem to not be addressed or acknowledged, then it's really hard to make change at that end of the continuum. If things don't change, even after being very clear in communication, then you move to the more formal end of the continuum, and that's where it's some sort of formal plan, and then there's a progression usually that resumes or follows. And so two other resources in the module this week are those continuums for gradual release in one, how you're addressing concerns, and then two, how you put interventions in place. And so interventions, even too, when I'm working with principals, and when I was a principal myself, sometimes I would even say, okay, have they watched themselves on videotape yet? Have they watched somebody else? There are some real, like, non-intrusive approaches to interventions that aren't a formal plan written out. And then finally, you are going to be given a framework for writing an improvement plan to use. But I also encourage you, and you'll see this in part of the assignment, to use your own district's framework for plans of improvement. So your application this week has 3 parts. You are going to learn and build your knowledge about addressing ineffective teaching practices. And so then there's 3 parts to your assignment. The first part is having a hard conversation. And so this is actually embedded within those slides. And so you are going to plan a conversation with a staff member regarding a scenario that is embedded in that first slide deck. And you're going to use those 6 provided questions to plan that conversation. The second part is going to using a scenario provided to you. You are going to diagnose, communicate, and design an intervention. And so use those resources and that continuum to determine what is the problem, how are you going to communicate the problem, and then what is the intervention to support it. And then finally, the third part of your application this week is to locate your own district's formal improvement plan process, and really dig into that to understand how that process works. And then I want to, before I close out for the week, I want to um, reiterate that this is 2% of evaluation. Really addressing ineffective practice. If you have a strong and effective evaluation process, the majority of your time will be spent just supporting and facilitating teachers and growing their own practice. When you get to this 2%, it's hard, especially the first couple of times that you have to navigate this. And so I really encourage you, like this module itself is not going to prepare you for this actual experience when you have it. And so I do encourage you to save these resources, all the resources from this course really, to refer back to, because I do think there's some really practical tools here. I am going to tell you, though, there is great importance in reaching out to somebody when you go through this process. So and it's not even when it gets on paper. So when you start to notice that there is concerns about ineffective teaching practices, reach out to somebody, whether it's one of your mentors, whether it's a colleague. Oftentimes when you're talking about ineffective practices, you need to let your HR department know. They are experienced in navigating this, both the logistical and just the policy procedures that a district has in place. They are also experienced in that emotional part, and can be there to help you navigate through the hard conversations. Really think through how to put that evidence together, because the better you engage in this process, the more likely it is that the outcome is going to be positive. Some of my strongest relationships with teachers to this day are teachers that I went through the process of addressing ineffective practices with. And I'm so proud of those teachers. And I'm also very proud of the relationship and the trust that the teacher and I built through the process. And so this is an important part of being an evaluator for many reasons, and it is not something that you should ever do alone. Even if you are experienced, it's important to reach out to somebody. So I hope that you have a great week and learn some things from completing this module. Thank you.